So today we are going to be taking a look at a seminal work on self-defense. Hi guys, my name is Joe and welcome to Fighting Words, the martial arts library. On this channel I review martial arts books and talk about other martial arts related subjects. The subject for today's review is Real Self-Defense by Geoff Thompson, published in 1993. Now, Mr. Thompson is pretty notable in the self-defense world. He's based out of the United Kingdom. Basically, he was a karate black belt who recognized that he was still afraid to engage in violence, so he became a bouncer for 9 years. And from his experiences has written books on self-defense, books on confronting fear, and things like self-actualization. In addition to his karate background, he's also spent time studying things like judo, wrestling, and boxing. And he sort of brings that to bear in his instructionals as well. Now, the book itself actually tries to be about as comprehensive as it can be. The early chapters, for instance, provide some ideas for just general overall safety, things like basically what we would refer to as keeping your head on a swivel, being aware of your surroundings, avoiding dark places in the middle of the night because that's where the attackers are. You will also address things like trying to overcome your fear, having different methods of doing that, including basically confronting the little fears before you get to the big fears. Some of the other advice he has on overcoming fear include things like positive self-talk, which to my understanding is still today things that are recommended in psychology for overcoming fear and anxiety. And he also talks about Mr. Negative, which is the internal voice that we have, the internal critic, in this case, the internal worrier who's afraid of things that might happen to you. Now, while the author emphasizes, in fact, it's one of his very early tips in chapter 1 actually, says, never fight if you have an opportunity to run. However, he will say, once the decision is made to fight, you need to fight back. Cowering and being complicit in your own victimization is not helpful. To that end, we begin looking at things like anatomical weapons and also incidental weapons. Among other things, I think he refers to, keeping a pepper shaker with you so you can undo the cap and throw the pepper in the guy's face. He talks about other incidental weapons that are more intuitive, like perhaps an umbrella. Sure, you can use that to whack someone or to, thrust it into their solar plexus or at their face. Pencils and pens, okay, that gives you something pointy to use. He also mentions credit cards that can be used for cutting people. I'm sort of skeptical of that. But then again, I wasn't using credit cards in 1993. Maybe the design has changed somewhat. He also goes over adrenaline triggers. And these are things that can, cause your adrenaline to spike, cause you to feel that rush, and that will pretty much give you a fight or flight intuition. Now, what he's suggesting is that if you are in what we would call social violence, if you are confronted, he prefers to either be sort of detached in your responses or being overly aggressive in your responses. In other words, somebody's like, you want to fight? And you go, all right, sure. That would be detached. The overly aggressive is somebody says, you want to fight? And you're like, yeah? And just go after the guy like, oh, you think you can take me? Come on, let's go. And he does know that that's not going to work on everyone, but there are definitely some people who will see that and go, okay, maybe I don't want a part of this. He also has a chapter on what he calls the lineup. And basically, in this context, a lineup is lining someone up for a big strike. The idea is you use verbiage and body positioning to sort of set the opponent up for a preemptive strike. like a cross, a hook. He includes a headbutt in here, for instance. He suggests using a statement or question, preferably a question, to engage the brain of the person who is trying to aggress you. And again, in context, this is meant to deal with someone who is being socially very aggressive and who is going to fight you anyway, but you're able to get the first shot in. He includes several chapters on various striking tools. The first one talks about, closed fist strikes, open hand strikes, and elbows. There's one on kicks, there's one on knees, one on headbutts. And throughout this, he also will include different types of equipment to use for these. Now, what's interesting is that despite including boxing in his background and including a lot of boxing strikes, he will actually eschew the use of the speedball, which is sort of that teardrop-shaped ball that you see in the Rocky movies where you're ba-da-da-ba-da-da-ba-da-da-ba-da-da. He says that's basically for exercising your delts and doesn't really build any practical skill, so he tends to not prefer that. He does prefer things like focus mitts, heavy bag for generating power, and the double end bag for working on your coordination. Another interesting point, at least to me, is that he doesn't really overstance a whole lot, or really at all. He covers it in some of his other books in what I consider the real series, but it's sort of absent here as far as discussion goes. With that being said, one of his demo dummies is basically demonstrating a karate type forward stance or fighting stance. After that, he has a chapter on chokes, and these range from, judo style gi chokes, like he has a sliding collar choke, your basic no-gi chokes, like, the rear choke and the guillotine choke, and also just like clawing at the guy's throat. He also includes actually like a side headlock, I guess with the intention of getting under the arteries from that side headlock position. The only one he really shows from the ground is basically a fist choke from what would be considered a scarf hold position. Following that, we get a chapter on throws. Most of these, again, come from judo, so lots of sweeps, reaps, and hip throws, basically. Then we get a set of chapters that I would call unusual situations. He has a chapter dedicated, for instance, to biting offensively. Another one on dealing with like weapons defense. And to me, this is sort of a mixed bag because you should kick the attacker's knee because that's your longest range attack. Cool. You should kick the weapon out of the attacker's hand. Okay. I thought that was one of those things that we agreed probably wouldn't work, but he includes it. And finally, there's a section on multiple attackers as far as these unusual situations go. And his primary advice under these conditions is to basically be super aggressive, attack first. Following that, we get another chapter on sort of the mechanics of the knockout, which frankly I think probably should have been put back with the same chapter as the lineup that we talked about earlier. After that, we actually get a chapter on hurdles and pitfalls to training. So these are both internal and external factors that may prevent us from getting in the training room and getting in the types of training that we need in order to deal with violence. And I would say the general message of this section is don't make excuses. If the objective is to train, you need to actually get out there and train. We then get a chapter on visualization and its place in sort of picturing how these scenarios are going to go down to sort of mentally prepare yourself. Following that is a chapter on the aftermath of violence. It's brief, but I think it's an important one where he points out that violence is going to take its toll on you and the people around you. That's sort of inevitable. After that, we get what I consider to be a very useful chapter. He refers to it as case studies. He interviews someone who has been a victim of group violence, And in the other case, he's interviewed two people who have enacted violence. They would basically pair up and mug people. And it's interesting to get both sides of that. So from the victim, we get, it bugs me that I didn't fight back. From the perpetrators, we get things, like this is how we would single out our victims, and this is the motivation we did for it. Sometimes it was just for a laugh. After that, we get another section on do's and don'ts, sort of like what we had up front. This is dealing more with the act of violence as opposed to preventing violence. It's things like, don't be too squeamish. If you need to stick your finger in a guy's eye to save your own life, then that's what you need to do. He advises, don't get too drunk. It's going to inhibit your ability to fight. He does finish by saying, don't do more than is necessary. And each of these get, besides a big, bold description, up to several sentences elaborating on the idea. We get another chapter that's basically on first aid, and this is sort of an overview of first aid. I would say if you are interested in real-world self-defense, first aid needs to be something that you study. You need to go to classes, you need to get certified in it, because violence can involve things like unconsciousness, punctures, broken limbs. So yeah, get there and study. I think this is a decent preparatory chapter. It goes over some pretty good stuff, but it's not meant to be all-encompassing. It does focus on someone who's unconscious and include some basic treatment for that, including things like the recovery position and basic rescue breathing and things like that. We then get a chapter on self-defense and the law. This is an important consideration. I'm glad he included it in here. This was printed over 30 years ago and in the United Kingdom. Look up the laws for your jurisdiction. Look up, see if the laws have changed in the last 30 years if you do live in the United Kingdom. Taking the law into consideration is vital for real-world self-defense. And finally, the last chapter is a rather brief one on extracurricular, where he talks about things like improving your fitness and getting into some sort of combat training, martial arts, wrestling, boxing, etc. As far as the pros go, this covers a broad spectrum. And I think if one is interested in self-defense, everything in here can be built upon later, but I also think everything in here is important, at least as an idea, to be introduced into the mind of the reader. Again, things like first aid, things like dealing with the law, things like the psychological part of it, which I think is another pro. It's really a good point, a strength of this book, that he talks about, addressing your fears and some tactics for overcoming some of those fears. And technically, the basic techniques that he shows are, pretty solid. They would be used in most self-defense programs. You got a set of strikes with the upper and lower body. You get some chokes, which are really good for rendering people unconscious. And then you get a set of throws, so you can put the other guy down and hopefully stay standing yourself. So while some of those might be things that could be pared down, while those might not necessarily be a complete fighting system, I do think that everything presented here could be used for self-defense depending on one's familiarity with the tools at hand. As far as the cons, going back to technique, there's really not anything on stance and footwork, and I would consider that important. You need to learn how to stand in order to have a good structure from which you can attack, and you need to know how to move without tripping over your own 2 feet. So I really think that had those been included in the book, it would have helped. On a more minor note, I think parts of this could have been organized a little bit better. As I mentioned, he talks about the lineup, and then several chapters later he talks about the anatomy of a knockout. And for instance, I think those could be put together. The section on the tips toward the end, like, don't be squeamish, I've mentioned that one. I think maybe that could have also been placed closer to the front. But overall, I still think it's a pretty good book, even with some of those drawbacks. As far as recommendations go, I don't think this is currently in print. I got mine secondhand. I think if you can get your hands on this is going to be a really good primer book for self-defense. If you have no martial arts background, no self-defense background, I think this is a good book to pick up in order to at least get your mind working in that direction. If you do have a martial arts background, like you know how to do punches and kicks, you know how to throw and choke people, but there might be parts of the self-defense equation that you might be missing. Things like, again, considering that you might need to know some first aid to like plug yourself up if you get stabbed. Things like taking the law into account, things like how people will engage you in order to set up a preemptive strike, and what you can look out for. I think all that stuff is helpful. So I actually think this does very well for sort of an all-in-one self-defense text. So that's all I have for this week. If you guys would like to sponsor a book review or help support the channel, please consider donating to my Ko-fi account. There's going to be a link in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please give me a like. Please share it with anyone you think would be interested. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing to my channel. And thank you for watching till the end of the video, and I'll see you guys later.